Welcome to My Psychedelic Roots, a podcast of conversations with people from a broad swath of lived experience to explore their psychedelic beginnings or roots, what led them to start using psychedelics, what those early experiences were like, and how those roots have impacted their life's unfolding. My name is Amy Bartlett, and it is my hope that these stories, generously shared by my guests, offer perspective and insight into the lived reality of psychedelic experiencing. Please feel welcome to subscribe and follow the show to get the latest conversations in your podcast feed. And you are always invited to share this episode with others if you feel inspired. And so, as always, whoever, wherever, or whenever you are, welcome. I'm glad you're here. In today's episode, I'm in conversation with Erika Dyck, a professor in the Department of History at the University of Saskatchewan, and one of the trailblazers of psychedelic research in Canada, having started her work long before the psychedelic revival began, and who continues to be a leader in the space. Specifically, her work focuses on 20th century medical history, especially the history of psychedelics, psychiatry, eugenics, and population control. She has many publications, but some that might be of interest include her books Psychedelic Psychiatry, LSD from Clinic to Campus, and Managing Madness, Weyburn Mental Hospital and the Transformation of Psychiatric Care in Canada. As we explore together, Erika grew up not far from Weyburn, Saskatchewan, the birthplace of the word psychedelic, and where a lot of psychedelic research was happening in Canada in the early days. You can also, as an aside, check out some of her writing on Humphrey Osmond, if you're interested. And yet Erika's roots were very much outside of that world. We wend our way through her secular on paper upbringing, her desire to get out into the world, and we talk about some of the early experiences that led to her eventually focusing her studies on the history of psychedelics in Canada and beyond. All before talking about some of her more recent and meaningful psychedelic experiences in communion with others and the natural world. In our conversation, we also talk about the importance that place has had in her life, from straddling the urban-rural divide when she was growing up, to finding her way back, not just to the geography, but also to the history and communities that shaped her and continue to shape her research and lived experience with psychedelics. As a small aside, between recording our conversation and doing the editing and polishing for publication, I had an unexpected medical unfolding, and am now officially gallbladderless. But as I recover from surgery, it has been interesting to come back to the conversation we had together and to reflect on the embodied and grounded nature of Erika's psychedelic roots from my own recent and intense embodied experience. It gave me a deeper appreciation for her precious and powerful sense of place and her deep connections to the land and the people around her, which is a real pleasure to see and experience in our conversation together. And so, let's hear more about Erika's psychedelic roots. Erika, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Amy.
So I've just read a little bit of your bio in the introduction, but as we jump into our conversation today, I'm wondering, is there anything that you think that's important that people know about you and your background and your life today before we jump into talking about your psychedelic roots?
Maybe I'll just say kind of somewhat briefly that I started studying psychedelics in earnest as a scholar in, the early 2000s when the conversation was really different. And so my relationship to psychedelic history has changed as the stories about psychedelics change quite a bit. And of course, my life has changed as well. I was, a carefree, 20-something, and now I'm an old mom. And I have different ideas about, both psychedelics, but also our responsibility when it comes to telling these stories, sharing these stories, and how we protect this information as well as spread it to the public. So that's where I'm at.
I love that. And part of me feels like you're uniquely placed to share your story in the sense of that archiving and the respect that these lived experiences should be having as part of the psychedelic canon and the psychedelic research that's happening. And I'm so grateful for all the research that you do and the visibility that you bring to the field.
Thank you.
So as we move into your psychedelic roots, I'd love to hear a little bit about little Erika and how you grew up. So thinking back to your younger self before psychedelics ever entered the picture, how would you describe your way of seeing the world or what felt true to you as a child?
Yeah, it's almost ironic in some ways. That might be a phrase that comes up a few times, but ironic or naive. I grew up in Saskatchewan, the
Mhm.
same place that I live now, the same place that coined the word psychedelic. I had no idea. I did not that was not the trail that was blazed before me, but instead I grew up in a farming family. I was the oldest of family of 4 kids, so I was blazing different trails, the oldest child trying to, match curfews and push your parents and break your parents a little bit, something I continue to do, I think, in some ways. And I always had this fantasy that I would escape at some point, that I would leave Saskatchewan, and ironically, I went to various different places. I studied in different places in Canada, including in Halifax at Dalhousie, at McMaster, in Hamilton. I taught for a while in Edmonton at the University of Alberta, and each time I kind of found myself pulled back to this place that I grew up that I kept trying to escape.
Mm.
And not only was it this sort of geographical draw because there were job opportunities and family needs, but also a kind of intellectual draw that I had. It's like I hadn't learned my lessons each time, and I had to keep coming back and being reminded, sometimes in subtle ways, that there was so much to learn from here, and some of the advantages I had, the privileges I had of learning from the deep community connections I had that my family had developed over generations was something that I had taken for granted. And I keep coming back to that. And even today, it continually kind of comes up. I need looking for something, whether it's support for one of my parents or whether it's a research question. And I find this incredible dynamic community, which
Mm.
for me as a researcher and at the cross sections of the history of health and health policy and of psychedelics, Saskatchewan really looms large as this place of, at one time at least, this place of a kind of magnetism for health innovation. And so it's really, even if people didn't stay in this place, it looms large in the imaginations of people who pass through this space, or even those who kind of fantasized about what would it mean to live in a trapezoid where you could, start things afresh, or so goes the logic. Of course it
Yeah.
wasn't afresh, but so the idea of Saskatchewan has really sort of played with my senses over the years, and kind of emotionally and physically captivated me here, even
Yeah.
though I love to escape.
Oh, that's amazing. It's really interesting to hear about your renegotiated and re-experienced relationship with where you grew up. I'm curious, when you were growing up, what was your experience of community or of those roots, that groundedness that you're experiencing now? Did you experience it then and then move away from it? Or does it feel like a coming back? Or does it feel like a new experience in a new place?
Yeah, it feels like a coming back for sure. And I think there are a few different layers to that. I guess, on a kind of superficial level, things that I took for granted, being a member of a community clinic or a co-op, these already established organizations or systems that embed you in a community. So you necessarily come to know people through those connections and you can't help it. And, as a kid, that was just what reality was. So I didn't
Right.
realize that, going to a walk-in clinic was so different from a community clinic where, I knew some of the names of the people working there and they knew me because I was born in that clinic, and and the, physiotherapist, his daughter played soccer with me while he was working on my ankle that she took out, there was just a familiarity that is partly small town-ish, even though Saskatoon is not itself an entirely small town. It's somewhat comparable to, say, Halifax, smaller than Hamilton, but it still has a feel of that because there are these imbricated organizations and systems in place that bring people into contact with one another. It's also the biggest thing around. If you wanna go and see, I've got a teenage daughter, so this will maybe be on point, but, if I had wanted to take her to a Taylor Swift concert, you'd have to drive or fly for many hours before that was even possible. So, people kinda cluster around this place because there isn't a Toronto next door or even an Ottawa nearby that provides an alternative. It's a day to get to another city other than Regina, which
Right.
is a bit more comparable. So I think that sense of both kind of being stuck also creates this kind of enclave or this community or cocoon of ideas. It's also a bit of an incubator for, if we're going to have to do something, we got to build it here. If we want a music
Yes.
festival, we have to build it.
Yes.
And so it has this kind of push-pull reality, I think, that creates a sense of belonging and also can create a sense of adventure.
Yes. Yeah.
Mhm.
Given that context and how you've described so beautifully, I was gonna say the rural Canadian. I grew up in a small town of 2,000 people in New Brunswick, and so everything that you just said feels really resonant, and yet it was a city, so I was gonna say rural, but it's maybe I won't bother with the urban-rural divide.
Well, it's tricky because my family were farmers, but we
Okay.
lived in the city, and my parents wanted kind of the best of both worlds in that respect. So, I had a foot in what I think people would recognize as a rural life, but our home, where we ate and what our postal code was relative to which schools we could go to was in the city. So, we had this access to urban amenities, and, my mother worked as a nurse in the city, so she had access to work, and 15 minutes the other direction, because we're right on the edge of town, my dad was farming. So, in a way, we were straddling these worlds and also experiencing very different community formation in those spaces. Uh,
Yeah.
that, there's a intimacy when you are reliant on other farm families around, for basic needs, especially the days before cell phones and various
Yes.
different, amenities, but also a closed-mindedness in some cases, and not to totally stereotype, but it's been an ongoing frustration that I know my parents have expressed as well, that they sometimes resent being classified as farmers
Mm.
because they feel that they have often urban sensibilities or progressive sensibilities that aren't often associated with a rural
Mm.
West. And I don't know if that pertains to New Brunswick either, but
Oh, yeah.
sometimes there are assumptions about how rural people will behave.
Yes.
And while we felt close to that, we also didn't feel quite connected there or quite, sort of anchored there.
Yes. In that sort of foot in two worlds type experience in childhood, did you feel safe? Did you feel secure growing up?
I think so. I guess the other thing that I didn't mention in terms of a layer of community is I have a Mennonite background. I've
Mm.
got a lot of cousins, and even if I wasn't always aware, and I have some embarrassing stories about not being aware, like, I always was surrounded by other people with my last name. I don't know, these were not first cousins, were not people that we knew from any family sense, and my grandfather was quite avid about knowing who we were related to, so I had perhaps an overblown sense of that relative to some of my cousins or even my siblings. Despite that, there were still occasions when, we'd show up somewhere and my dad would be talking to someone. I'm like, "Why are you talking to that football player from my school?" And he's like, "Well, he's your cousin, right?" And while that had awkward feelings were maybe drawn from that as well, but there was always this sense that you were never really that far away from something familiar, and whether it was familiar in the sense that this person could be your cousin, or familiar in the sense that, like, "Oh, yeah, we shop at the same place," or, we hold these values, that network of familiarity really extended quite widely, and I think that definitely gave a sense of safety or grounding
Mm.
and community. And again, these are things that I've only realized, many, many years on,
Of
looking
course.
back, and at the time, I think, you just like many kids, you think you're invincible, and this is just the way it is, and you take these things for granted, and
Yes.
certainly I would put myself in that category.
Yes. Not a unique experience in
Right,
childhood, I'm
right.
sure.
Did not have insights.
You mentioned your Mennonite background. I'm curious, when you were growing up, what was your relationship to wonder or spirituality or even altered states of consciousness?
Yeah, I describe myself as a culinary Mennonite. I'm there for the food.
Mhm.
So, the only Mennonite words that I know, or the Low German words that I know, relate to food. So, for me, the only time that I spent in a Mennonite church were at funerals for my father's family. So, to me, it was quite separate. My grandfather, so he was sort of the last one in the line. My paternal grandfather was raised Mennonite, definitely spoke Low and High German, and became an English teacher, married a British woman who was Methodist, so that kind of aligned with their temperance ideas. But when it came to open discussions about religion and anything that we might now consider spirituality, there was a very kind of secular move. And it,
Huh.
it was interesting. I think my grandfather was determined to have an unaccented English. So, nobody wanted to sound German during the Second World War. And part of that was so deeply tied to what they describe as church German or church behaviors, even in a social network, that
Hmm.
really, I think the conversation about religion was eclipsed at that space, in a way to promote being a good Canadian. And this is obviously, I'm a historian, so, this stuff is my bread and butter, but, this is a product of Second World War attitudes. It's a product of anti-German attitudes. And so all of these things kind of make sense rationally when you think about it. But emotionally, as a kid, I didn't know how to make sense of this, and I didn't know any different. My mother's
Yeah.
side also had German roots. They were Lutherans. She was baptized Lutheran, my mother was. But it wasn't a conversation that we ever had, and I didn't see anything on display either at holidays or celebrations. Nothing was sort of draped with a sense of religiosity, even in a superficial way. I mean, we celebrated Christmas, not Hanukkah, so, I mean, there I could say, "Yeah, we're probably Christian," but honestly, beyond that, it really the conversation stopped and most things were quite secular. My parents are avid readers, their parents are avid readers, so there are lots of conversations around dinner tables and family meetings and road trips about politics. And I think politics was our religion.
Right.
We all engaged and, we've all door knocked for formerly the CCF. I wasn't old enough to do that, but then the NDP. And that became the place where discussions about values and, responsibilities to the community, things that you might get in a church setting, really kind of flourished in that environment. And so, again, only in hindsight do I say, like, I think that was kind of our conduit to religion. And it's not that politics don't involve religion, but for us, that wasn't part of the conversation. And it was only afterwards. I'm like, oh, I think that's where these things were interwoven. And that sense of core values or, role models and where you look for how to be a good person really came out of that kind of socialist pulpit, if you will.
Yeah. Very interesting. Given that background religious, but not sort of spiritually practicing,
Mm.
and politically active and progressive conversations and value-based culture within the family, I'm curious, were psychedelics ever mentioned? Were drugs ever mentioned? Because there's so much puritanical sort of overlay on this drug conversation. Did a beautiful job of introducing, you grew up in Saskatchewan where so much was happening in Weyburn and so many other places. So, were drugs ever talked about in your family, either positively or negatively, or what was your perception of them? Was it something you were interested in or was just not even part of your consciousness?
It wasn't really a conversation at home. I mean, my parents and my grandparents, I never saw them drink alcohol.
Mm,
Uh, not until later, I think as my parents had 4 teenagers in the house at the same time, we drove them to drink a bit. But, I mean, that's the first time I ever saw a beer in their hands, like, it wasn't excessive by any stretch, but it just wasn't something that we saw growing up. In our family home, of course, we've got cousins and relatives. It wasn't that I didn't know these things existed. It wasn't quite that stark. But it wasn't really until probably high school when my friends were experimenting with psychedelics and other things as well. But that was my first real foray into this and thinking, well, psychedelics and listening to a lot of music that we know now is inspired by psychedelics, but I was pretty naive. I was kind of wandering into these spaces and I was curious. I was an adventurer. I wanted to leave. I was looking for my way out. And, I had a few friends who were quite involved in the drug scene, some who overdosed and died. I felt like I was often the designated driver to the extent that I was the designated sitter in a number of
mm,
cases. And partly I think it may have been my own trepidation, maybe a bit of caution, conservatism when it came to, embracing these kinds of experiences. And I didn't have the experiences to draw from in any other parallel. But I was still curious about why these people were doing this, and, these were my friends. And I saw some bad things happen.
yes.
And it sustained my curiosity sufficiently to continue studying what's going on here. But I will say that when I eventually turned to more, sustained scholarly study of psychedelics, my first inspiration, had you asked me in 1997, why are you going to do this? And it took me a while to get started. But when I started in earnest, I think it was 2001 when I started my PhD, I think I would have said that I came to study how it was that this so-called socialist government, and we can be critical of how they achieved their aims, but this so-called socialist government, why were they investing in something so out there in terms of healthcare reforms? It did not seem to fit with health policy discussions that I'd grown up with around the table. And it was partly that combined with, and here I'll come back to my farming roots, the birth of sort of big pharma and the way that big pharma sort of overwhelms the conversation about mental health and addictions, and even in a very superficial way as a kid, in an impressionistic way, had real parallels with the way my father and our farmer neighbors talked about GMOs and fertilizers and and the sort of takeover, and the way that people with experience, in this case with the land, with the this microclimate, with this particular way the hill goes, this slope, that just kind of gets pushed aside in this sense of universalizing food production. My father was a potato farmer, so even we're a little bit strange in Saskatchewan, where it's mostly wheat and canola, and you think about these pulse crops, but here we are growing food. And for a time, my father was the president of the Vegetable Growers Association. So they're sitting around the table with these other food producers. And I remember as a kid overhearing some of these conversations, or sometimes being alive enough to to pay attention to them. But this sense of being rendered helpless despite generations of experience. And that really resonated with me in ways that, again, I didn't say, aha, this is how it works. But it was 20 years later, I'm like, oh, my dad was teaching me something.
Right.
I was that, defiant teenager. But that environment really left a remarkable impression on me, I think, in terms of these systems of evidence that displace or disconnect people from their own knowledge systems and even their trust of themselves in navigating different environments that might be intimately familiar to them. And I see parallels in the psychedelic world. And again, I wasn't ready to like make that interpretive link. I only see that now. But it was definitely a piece of the inspiration that led me to I didn't initially go and look at a bunch of psychedelic trip reports. I was looking at, like, annual health reports and budgets and policy documents to try to understand, how did the funding work to bring these people here in the first place, and what kind of people were willing to take the risk of moving from England or Kansas or Prague to engage in something that did not have a proven track record, but that, at least from the beginning, and I would say even after the beginning, wanted to privilege experiential knowledge. And that sort of clash of how we produce evidence and what it means, even if I couldn't articulate it, is something that has continued to drive me ever since.
Yes. So well put. And coming back to your lived experience,
Mhm.
you talked about being a teenager, not being aware of these larger social machinations, but
Mhm.
experiencing them, and in the context of them, also having personal experiences of watching friends take drugs or have psychedelic experiences, and also having experiences of losing people in that
Mhm.
context and with substances. How did you make that transition from having those lived experiences and observing to moving towards wondering if that's something that you might want to experience or that you want to engage in? Was it that wanting to escape piece? Was it the curiosity? Was it all of the above, none of the above? I'm curious where that observing became curiosity for yourself and not just a curiosity about the world.
I mean, 2 things really spring to mind as you ask that question, and one is that you know, probably like a scene out of Monty Python, I bravely ran away. This was my ejection seat, and I moved to Ontario for a while, and I spent time working in a law firm. I spent time, basically paying off some student loans and trying to ground myself both financially, but also intellectually. So remove myself from this environment that It was neither horrible nor fantastic. It just was, and it was a time of life when I had the capacity to get up and move. And in that context of living in Toronto and, navigating public transit, and I felt a little bit like I was, very it was so seductive and so easy to sort of fall into the trappings of, like, I could just work 9 to 5 or 9 to 12 or
Yeah.
what the hours the law firm would allow, which was pretty much endless.
Mhm.
I could pay off my loans, and I could numb myself. I literally will numb myself, and I could feel. I've described this to my friends before, so regardless of my sense of spirituality, I literally felt my soul leaching out of my body, you know?
Yes.
It's somewhere in the doldrums of Toronto, and not because I'm a Western Canadian who's, acculturated to dislike Toronto. I actually quite enjoyed living in Toronto, but I did feel a kind of numbness take over as I thought about, okay, well, how can I apply what I've learned as a historian, as an undergrad in history who was always interested in how did things get to be the way they were? What's the origin story? How do we understand this? How do we use narrative to make sense of the world? Those are really useful skills. And it definitely was useful as I transitioned into, working as a legal secretary. But I felt I could see the kind of dead ends coming for me. And I reached out. Actually, I had a friend who died in a tragic accident,
Mm.
and I was not permitted to go to the funeral, so I quit. I went to the funeral anyway, and it was kind of a turning point. It again, not one that I recognized in the moment, but, I just sort of cut myself from the straps of safety that I felt at the moment, which was job relative security and certainly a paycheck I'd never seen the likes of before, and I said, "No." And with very little warning or preparation, I sort of scrambled to look into a PhD program at that point, and I was like, I think I need to feed this intellectual curiosity more before I can settle into something that was nice and secure. Again, in hindsight, it all seems so clear. But I dove into my PhD, and perhaps because I'd been working literally, in some cases, 17-hour days, like I was working a ton, the PhD was like a dream, you know? "What do you mean? I get to read all day, and there's a scholarship for this, and all I gotta do is, like, think about it and write about it?" I mean, it's not just that, it's many, many hard things, but it felt freeing, and it felt like a lift, and so pouring my energy into that was really I felt that kinda transition moment, and it probably took a few more years before I kinda had the aha, "Okay, now I actually feel back in the driver's seat, and I can think about whether or not or how and what to integrate." So I knew I had work ethic, so I could get it done, but was I doing anything meaningful? Coming back to, okay, then I went back home to Saskatchewan, which is where most of my research subjects were, or at least had been. Many of them had retired to other places, but the archives were there. And so here I was, plunged back in community, but with this kind of passport, if you will, of having been other places, and I still paid rent in another place. So it felt safer again. I could now study this both at home, but kind of as a fly on the wall in some ways. And
Yes.
it regrounded me, or I was back in a safety container. But I think in terms of my own, if you're asking the question about my own psychedelic experiences,
Mm.
yeah, I mean, I would say that I had a few sort of trivial experiences before in the context of those friends who were trying all manner of things and, obviously not all responsibly, but they weren't that meaningful. And I thought, "Oh, I should try this because I'm gonna sit with these people. I should try these things once in a while." But it didn't feel like it landed. I was like, "Is this thing on?" It was
Yes.
that kind of, people talk about these earth-shattering experiences or things like that, and, even sitting with my friends, I would witness them, and sometimes help them, go through experiences, and it didn't land for me. So, I was like, "Alright, well, try something else." Travel and reading was, nourished me more than those initial experiences, and it wasn't until much, much later in my life that after a period, I'd say, of trying to maintain a scholarly front, so being very careful, and certainly in the early 2000s, being very careful about what kinds of substances I would take or even whether or not I would admit to taking them. It felt not safe to talk about things then. And as the thaw comes back in, or as the veil is lifted, if you will, and there's an expectation, I've been a little bit more cautious about where I engage. And I'll give an example of one that's profoundly meaningful to me. A few years ago, I came across a bunch of photographs and archives about a peyote ceremony that took place in Saskatchewan in 1956. The guy that I studied, Humphrey Osmond, coined the word psychedelic. He was attendant. He participated in the ceremony. And I was asking for permission to use one of the photographs, and I got a hold of the grandson of one of the people who had been at the ceremony. And he's like, "Well, you should come visit us." So I did. I drove up to Sturgeon Lake First Nation, and I brought the photographs, and I brought a thumb drive with all the documents I could find. I was like, "I think your family's in the archives. Like, do you want this stuff?" And he sort of put it aside and, like, was kind and looked at some photos, but kind of put it aside and said, "You should stay and visit with us." And we've essentially been visiting ever since. We engage in all sorts of research projects, including one that we've been talking about this morning. But I sat in a peyote ceremony then that day without preparing. I drove out to give them articles and photographs, and I was like, "Well, you should stay and do ceremony," and it seemed like the right thing to do, and that felt profoundly more satisfying, interesting, aligned than any experimentation that I had engaged in as this kind of wayward teenager before, and 20 something, I should say. I wasn't just a teenager. And that it's kind of caused me to reflect back on this and think about things that we hear but are hard to integrate until you feel them. I don't know if that makes any sense at all. Like, I know this to
100%.
be true. It's kind of like
Mhm.
what I tell my kids, like, just don't do it 'cause I said so, right? Like, I don't have the capacity to explain my justification for punishing you in this way, just, like, do what I do because 'cause I'm tired. In a maybe gentler version of that, like, I know that set and setting matters. I know that context is incredibly important, and I know that these things can sometimes be even more significant than the pharmacological experience. Sure. However, you know,
Wait
learning to
till you
think with my
experience it.
heart
Mhm.
is really hard. You know? I've spent all this time trying to, like, use my brain to make executive decisions and function through an intellectual framework, and learning to think with my heart took a long time to even articulate. I mean, I could say it, but I didn't know what it meant, and
Yes.
I still don't have better ways of describing it. But I remember one of the elder grandmothers came to me and she said, "You're still in here,"
Mm.
and with a gentle adjustment, and again, I'm like, "But I don't know how." There wasn't a guidebook or a textbook, even though you intuitively know you have to make that connection. And so some of these experiences probably sound incredibly naive. I've been working in this space for so long, but it's this subtle adjustment and subtle rearrangement, and this is down the road from where I grew up. It is about 6 miles from where my mother was raised. This is so close to home and so aligned with my cousins live down the street. This is it's I didn't go to Costa Rica, not that there's anything wrong with Costa Rica, but I just mean this I keep coming home in different ways,
Yeah.
in layers of physical and emotional and spiritual ways. And this most recent set of experiences over the last few years with the First Nations community has, again, it's like I'm changing my prescription on my glasses and I can see things that have been so familiar to me, but I see them in a fresh way.
Yes. I'm so interested in this transition from knowing something theoretically to knowing something in an embodied and personal or spiritual way. Has working with that community and working with peyote, was that the first time you felt that bridge?
I don't I think probably there are other examples. That sensation you get when you're like, but I know this is correct and I don't know how to prove it yet. And
Mhm,
I don't even know what resources I should be mustering right now to prove it. Like, should I use a louder voice or should I go and look in a book or on
mhm.
the internet or whatever it might be? And trying to sort of hold that space, whether it's a truth or a perspective. There's a shifting ground there in terms of how you do that and in what context, how you arrange those things.
Mhm.
And I think, all of that sense of intuition for how we position ourselves, I should not all of it, a good chunk of it, much of it went out the window. And it was, that realization was very humbling, and it was such an incredible gift.
Yeah.
It didn't feel like roadblocks. It felt like, completely opening up a new portal that, you kinda know is there, but you don't really know how to get there.
I find a lot of folks experience it that way or describe it that way. It's when we come to truth, it's a remembering
Mhm.
rather than learning something new. I'm curious, in that experience or in those experiences that have become very meaningful to you, what are some of the truths that you've learned, or what's become accessible, or what have you remembered?
Hmm. There are a lot of different things, and, it's sometimes talking to people about psychedelic. I've read hundreds, maybe thousands of psychedelic trip reports, both in clinical settings and in non-clinical settings. And, they're all different, they're all unique, and they also follow some patterns, and sometimes you can see, oh, here some godlike creature will appear and breathe in some truth. And not to trivialize those, they're profoundly meaningful. But you read 1,000 of them and you're like, okay, here's the story arc. Yeah. 9 hours. Okay, this was LSD. You can you start to recognize these, and we have to sort of make shorthand assumptions. And so, I I run the risk of, expressing a kind of cliche in telling my own story. And yet, there are these moments that, again, you read them 1,000 times and you're like, "Okay, that's true." And then all of a sudden you're like, "Oh, now it's true for me." Right?
Exactly. Exactly. So, yeah, what's true for you is just as important as, or perhaps more important than the patterns. What was true for you, or what is true for you?
There's, one experience in particular that comes to mind was a profound sense of it was sort of like being transported into my infant son's psyche, maybe into his body even. And just a quick backup. So my son was born 25 weeks. Most pregnancies are supposed to last 40, so quite early. He was 1 pound at birth and not expected to survive. So we spent 4 months in the hospital. He was on all sorts of different machines, including obviously he was intubated and had no lungs. And I can speak about this calmly and, even make jokes about it now because he's 14 and he's a regular stinky teenager and, very lovable and wonderful, but he's doing really well. But at the time it was a very precarious moment, and I think I've probably, protected myself by, putting that into a box and like he's good now and we just leave it alone. But not that long ago, even within the last year, I had one of these experiences where I had to breathe for him in what I was understanding. And I was sort of panicking. Like, I almost felt like I couldn't breathe. It would perhaps, there's a kind of melding of, this poor little infant who was on these breathing tubes, and, like, I physically felt that I couldn't breathe, and I had to breathe for him to sustain life. And, I looked up, and there were all of these sort of trees around me who were my grandparents and my grandparents' parents, and so some of whom I've met and some of whom I did genealogy with my grandfather. I only know by name and where they fit on the tree. And they were all, providing oxygen as trees do. And, it just was this kind of hug of the trees and a breathing of oxygen, a sharing of the oxygen and the exchange of the carbon dioxide and, my son was breathing and he was hugging me and, this kind of embrace of all of these generations, but also this embrace that encompassed the relationship between nature and me and my son, and really profound. And also, in some ways, a cliche. We realize that we're part of nature, we realize that we're connected to our ancestors, and I don't mean to trivialize that, but the point at which reading all of this and knowing that those can be true and feeling that, oh, this is true for me, that I was no longer the fly on the wall, but I was actually part of the learning process and part of the feeling, the healing, the spirituality. it rested in me too, and that I,
Yes.
as a historian, I'm often observing something else and describing it, and here I'm, imbricated in the story itself, and that is something I'm still integrating and perhaps always will be.
Yes. Wow, thank you for sharing that story. It's deeply profound. I'm curious what your ongoing relationship might be with your ancestors or with nature.
Yeah, I was close with my both sets of grandparents. Well, sorry, there were 3 grandparents who were alive when I was, and I was close with all of them. In fact, at different times, they lived with us. So I had, I think, a really privileged relationship as the eldest in the family. I also had more cognition to draw from. I could have more, meaningful conversations, but 2 of my grandparents lived until I was in my 20s. So I had a wonderful opportunity to connect with them, and my grandfather in particular on my dad's side was very interested in genealogy, his own as well as his wife's family, but also others. So he was curious about all of these connections all the time and was constantly making them, much to everyone's annoyance when you're actually trying to get somewhere and he's talking to the person at the bank about, who their grandfather might have been, and you're like, but grandpa, I got to get to my soccer game. But I've come to appreciate that his desire to, connect all of these things, this kind of mycelium network or the Mennonite mycelium, if you will. I'm not sure that's copyrighted. But it helped to stimulate a curiosity in me that I at first kind of rejected. But it is curious. I've remained curious about how these things, these people, these, even inanimate objects, how they connect and where we find those touch points. So that's still important, and in fact, my partner and I were just doing some genealogy on his family, like, just this weekend, and, it's quite fun. I still quite like it, and most other people just, like, leave the room because they just couldn't be bothered, but it's still a fascination that we share, and we're interested in this, and then we read about these time periods and these people and, imagine what life might have been for them. So, I come by my training or my I come by it honestly. That's
Yes.
what I'm trying to say.
I'm curious about your relationship to your ancestors in the present and perhaps in the future, and
Mm.
also that relationship to nature that was so supportive and bridging in that experience that you described.
Yeah, I think with ancestors, I'll just briefly say too, I think that a number of my family members are on my mind. They come in and out of my mind, sort of effortlessly, and however you frame this, I mean, I'll have dreams about conversations with my grandparents, for example, not so much distant grandparents or, distant ancestors, although occasionally that's true too. And my grandmother on my mom's side often talked like this, that she would wake from a dream that she was, having a conversation with her brother who'd been dead for many years, and, this was so normal that as kids, we sometimes confused who was alive and who was dead because she would just
Right.
like it was a matter of fact. So I think for better or worse, I've absorbed a quality of that, whether I just kind of like, ignore the reality boundaries or just embrace the comfort that that gives. In terms of nature, though, I think in that particular moment, the embrace of the trees was kind of arresting. It was not something that I was expecting. I mean, not only in the context of things, but I was like, "Oh, yeah, the trees. Like, I'd forgotten about you."
Yeah.
It was sort of like, and they were huge. I was in BC on an island, and so these are, like, massive trees that were sort of towering over, and they really were there. The fact that they had, embodied, my ancestors was the profound piece, but they were so formidable.
Yes.
Immediately, I could imagine their roots, like, reaching out so far, and they were so stable. Even as they waved in the wind, they were just they're not going away.
Yeah.
And that was incredibly comforting in the moment, and it was just a kinda, like, silly reminder, like, "Oh, yeah, nature." So, I would
Silly.
say that it was, again, a kinda silly, naive realization, but I think that I had been taking nature for granted.
Mm. I'm so glad that you had an experience of both feeling so supported by all who came before you and who you sit on top of, in your genealogy, but also feeling so supported by what is around you and all
Mm,
of the support. What a deeply calming and resourcing experience with an emotion that would have been so intense and scary and isolating. Oof.
yeah. It did feel almost like, hmm, I don't wanna say closure because I don't think it's the end, but it brought it brought something to the experience of my son that, you know, I think that once he got better, once he was allowed to leave the hospital and, things seemed to be in the clear, we sort of didn't look back because it still felt precarious and you almost didn't wanna jinx it or you didn't wanna, mess things up by looking back, and many, many times we've talked about we should go back and just go and visit the ward even if it's not the same people working there, but, I remember as a mother, you can't really hug a cold isolate or do anything, and so you're that outside person looking in at this tiny fetus that's struggling to survive, and, there were moments when I wished I could see someone, like my son on the other side. Here's my 14-year-old hockey player, like, it's possible,
Yes.
and I think the experience that I had recently is well, it's given me courage to open up a little bit about that in the way that I might be supportive to others. Now, it doesn't mean that my son feels that way. He's, at peak embarrassment phase of his life. Doing things his mom wants to satisfy others is not on his radar, but but that's his own journey. But it was just comforting. It was comforting to feel that all connected and that it was okay
Yes.
to talk about this. It was okay to have the feelings that I did and that everything was going to be okay.
Yes.
So it felt like the right moment to have that exhalation. Yeah, I could just exhale.
Exactly. So beautiful, Erica. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm so glad, I don't know if you feel this. You being reminded of the support around you, I wonder also, it's a reminder that your son is so supported.
Yeah,
The chain, the continuity of that experience. So beautiful.
it is. And it's I think that the other thing that sometimes we don't see in those trip reports is, a few years out as people are still integrating those moments, which we know happens. Again, here's my head talking. And then if I try to respond with my heart a little bit, recognizing things, and it may be as simple as not taking something for granted. Like, honestly, I wanted to hug my mom,
Yeah.
you know, and and just say, gosh, like, man, you not only did you put up with me in all these other moments, but when I was a brand new mom, I must have been not the best to be around. And everybody understood, but just being able to articulate that, being able to put words on that and name it was, in itself a kind of gift.
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad for all these rememberings that you've been gifted with and that you've created spaces to be able to experience. That's lovely. Erica, as we wrap up our conversation, is there any advice that you would give to someone who is thinking about their first psychedelic experience or someone who is integrating some of the
Mhm.
experiences that they had?
Yeah. I feel I feel ill-equipped to give, like, advice per se, and I think, I see that as a good thing, actually. That, I don't think there is a guidebook. I don't think there's a manual for how to do this, when to do this, who you should do it with, because I think in order to, identify the guardrails that we need, we do have to think about where we are, why we're doing it in the first place, and again, my more frivolous experiences, I don't think they meant anything because they didn't. They didn't mean it. Like, they were fun maybe, but or if even that, I mean, but I didn't know how to set intentions,
Mhm.
and I've come to appreciate that for me, and sometimes it's not because, like, I've got, everything laid out perfectly ahead of time, it just the opportunity comes up, like, bringing archival photos or something. But I think, just spending some time thinking about your own guardrails, what's important to you. It doesn't have to be a major thing where you write a book about it or something, but just like spend some time with yourself. And, and I think it's incredible the kinds of resources we have within us, even when, they're sometimes projected as external forces in these moments, but they're projections of things that we have within us that sometimes we're not ready to face, or sometimes we've forgotten, or even feel embarrassed or shameful about. And that's not to say that it's not, like, I think we should all exercise caution and, not jump into these experiences lightly, but yeah, I don't know that there's a manual, but I really encourage people to share their experiences, because I think it's through that kind of collective community knowledge exchange that we both build capacity for knowing how and when, but we also continually build capacity for integration, because I think sometimes I worry a little bit that the language makes it sound like there's a plan, or like you do it this way and then 2 days later you do this and then after 5 days you'll feel that. And I just don't think that's true. And I think that it actually might be somewhat um dangerous, or it sets up expectations that can be a little bit frustrating if you don't have those experiences or if things don't line up. And what I can say from both personal experience and from reading lots and lots of other people's experiences, there is no one way. That's a non-answer.
No, that's the best answer. Thank you for sharing your way and for some of the insights and tendernesses, specialness and uniqueness of your own choices and your own path in this space. I want to thank you so much, Erika, for taking the time and for sharing a little bit about your psychedelic roots and your psychedelic experiencing. It's been a real pleasure hearing your story.
Thanks, Amy.